Africa. Kalle udu sihai. Samayado ipatla sabo pino. Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the plight of women and youth, unemployment, gender-based violence and displacement episode of Ubuntunomics. Hello, Swu. How are you doing today?
No, hi, I'm fine. Thank you, Sia. How are things?
I'm very well, thank you. And with us today is Zama from M&M Legal. Hi, Zama. How are you today?
Hi there, Swu. Hi, Sia. How you doing? I'm well, thanks. How you guys?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah,
as usual, we've missed you.
Good.
I missed you guys as usual. I missed you guys. I'm happy to be back.
Welcome back. And we have a bumper week this week. We'll be looking at the 2021 local election candidates nominations, which closed on Monday, the rising unemployment rate in South Africa, gender-based violence, and the IP summer school. And we'll be looking at youth involvement and the bubonic plague in the DRC, and finally the displacement of people in Sudan and South Sudan. So let's get started with the essay update for this week. Our first story in the essay update this week is the nominations close for the 2021 local government elections. So nomination of candidates for the 2021 local government elections closed on Monday at 9 p.m. and there were over 270 unique political parties that submitted candidates, and an additional 944 independent candidates who are vying for 10,478 municipal council seats. Currently, there are 480 registered parties, of which 298 are registered at national level and 182 are registered at local level, which entitles the affected parties to contest in any municipal council in the country. And a total of 7 million rand has been collected for election deposits, which the IEC will refund to parties based on the amount of seats they are allocated in the municipal council they're contesting. And for independent candidates, the deposits are refunded if they receive at least 10% of the total number of votes cast in the ward that they're contesting. Sbu actually had a comment on this one regarding the possible postponement of these elections. What was your point, Sbu?
No, I was saying criticism directed at the IEC for creating confusion regarding these local government elections is valid. It is pretty valid because this organization, which is tasked with organizing elections, and it is a revered organization the world over. It is revered for running free and fair elections, but this time around it was caught napping. I think about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we covered the stories concerning this matter, and we're looking to see which option the IEC would take, whether they would be going to the courts or going to Parliament to seek for a solution like and a postponement. But as with most things, most political problems in South Africa, the Constitutional Court was once again saddled with resolving the impasse. I think the Constitutional Court is getting over politicized, political parties this week were running frantic. They've been trying to meet the cut-off target time to put in their candidate lists. Now, there has already been casualties with parties like the PAC who were not able to make that deadline. They relied mainly on the judgment that the Constitutional Court was supposed to hand out, but that has been postponed. That has been the judgment will come in a bit later, so they missed out on the boat. There are now questions and doubts over and above the COVID-19 pandemic. There are doubts now regarding intimidation because we have the army on army boots are on the ground since the civil unrest. So parties like the EFF are claiming that the government is acting unconstitutionally, and this is a tactic for the ANC to retain power, they say. So I don't know. Do you think there is a possibility maybe that these elections might still be postponed here?
Yes, I do think that they will more likely be postponed, because if you look at the wording in terms of the application from the IEC for the postponement, is that they have the capacity to organize the elections. However, the elections won't be free and fair, as is a constitutional requirement. So it would be a surprise for the Constitutional Court if the Constitutional Court were to force elections to proceed, given this assertion. Obviously, the crucial matter is whether or not the Constitutional Court feels as though the grounds on which the IEC claims the elections would be unfree are actually valid grounds. Moving on to our next story from South Africa, the worst unemployment levels since the beginning of the quarterly labor force surveys in 2008. The official unemployment rate has increased to 34.4% in the second quarter of 2021 from 32.6% in the first quarter of this year, and the broadly defined unemployment rate has increased to 44.4% from 43.2% in the first quarter. The country now has 3 provinces with at least 50% broad unemployment rate, including the Eastern Cape at 53%, Northern Cape at 50.3%, and Limpopo just on the edge with 49.9%. In the second quarter, South Africa lost 375,000 formal non-agricultural jobs and gained 184,000 informal non-agricultural jobs, informal sector jobs. And the sectors that lost the most jobs in the second quarter are finance at 278,000, community services at 166,000, and manufacturing at 83,000 jobs lost. While the biggest gains came from construction, which added 143,000 jobs, trade, which added 108,000 jobs, and agriculture, adding 69,000 jobs. Zama, you had a point about this, given that this is such a central problem in South Africa that we're still challenged with resolving.
Yeah, this bothers me a lot. And, when in our stories in previous weeks, we have sort of, been tracking what's going on with unemployment, and it's getting worse. And I keep sort of saying over and over again, the South African economy has been suffering, little to no growth rates for some time, even before COVID. And this current unemployment level takes us back to about 20 years ago, about 3 administrations back. So I really believe that the government needs to have a proper fiscal and monetary expansion policy properly outlined and implemented, right? And I mean, I know we have the budget speech and all that, but I think we need to be clear. And another thing that I notice is that I believe the government needs to engage more in developing small businesses, right? And creating opportunities for entrepreneurs to create jobs. So I noticed that the cost of borrowing has decreased from the perspective of the government when I take into account all the relief that they've been providing and offering, which is mainly based on low interest rate loans, right? However, banks are not catching up. So this could potentially call for the lowering of the prime rate of interest when we're looking at a monetary policy perspective, right? From a fiscal perspective, I think government spending needs to improve in order to drive demand for broader macroeconomic stability. So government should truly make an effort to follow its economic recovery plan, particularly from the perspective of spending on infrastructure. Because I really think we really don't see the government sticking to what they say they're supposed to do, or we don't even have proper visibility on what it is they're supposed to be doing.
Definitely. Look, I agree with you on 2 points there. Some also I want to challenge, I want to push back on. So I think firstly, we have to take the informal sector very seriously. The numbers I presented to earlier in terms of the unemployment rate shows that, we've actually gained over 184,000 informal sector jobs. However, if you look at the landscape in terms of our government support policies, they really are formalized, and I don't think that government really has a way forward in how they will actually support the informal sector and how they will relax things such as the stringent financial requirements which are in place for beneficiaries to be able to benefit from government incentive programs or even government concessional funding, etc. And I think in many instances when government has informal sector in mind, they're probably thinking medium enterprises, and for me, we're even talking micro enterprises, and in many cases, informal enterprises as a whole. And I think this also speaks to another point you made around the infrastructure, that we need to invest in infrastructure. And I think here is where the crucial detail comes into play as to what kind of infrastructure we're talking about. Because I think we need to dig deeper than the current business as usual approach of saying, let's build roads, let's build high-speed rail, transport for public, transport systems, etc. We need to actually be thinking of how do we connect the various segments that have been separated by a legacy of apartheid, which in terms of our spatial geometry as a country, we haven't even begun to challenge or change in any way meaningful. Sbu, you had a point around some of the commitments that government has made and also sticking to them.
Yeah, I also share the same views that this is the biggest problem faced by the country, because it gives rise to other social problems, things like crime, violent crime, drug and alcohol abuse, child neglect, high dropout rates, despondency, and ultimately the breakdown of society. So unfortunately, judging by the failure to come up with solutions, the state has been outsourcing this problem. It looks like they've thrown in the towel. They've tried to outsource the problem by holding a lot of these investment and job summits with no results at all. I mean, because these are like, it all boils down to the export-led growth paradigm, and this business of taking their responsibility and shoving it onto the private sector. Because even the YES program, as an example, the initiative by the president, it was a monumental failure. I mean, only about 10% of the envisaged jobs were created. I mean, on the other hand, you have the private sector, which is, in a way, they are clear about their inability for this economy to create jobs, and their own inability to create these jobs, because they point out saying that the subdued economic conditions mean that it will take long to repair the damage caused by the lockdowns on the economy, and they talk about an increase in job creation is not going to happen in the short term.
And I think the point you're raising here, Sbu, resonates with my point around we can't have a business as usual approach. I think crucially here what government needs to understand, because government has also made the president has made the commitment that they're going to scrap all experience requirements for entry-level jobs in government. That hasn't happened. And that could have been a big impact in terms of reducing particularly youth unemployment. Then secondly, for me, is the fact that we cannot be having business as usual approach here. What the government always tries to do is lower the cost of business and lower the cost of business operations as a way to increase the profitability of existing business. But actually, what needs to be done is we need to unlock the creativity and potential that exists in the informal sector, the township economies, and use that creativity in order to restructure the economy and the spatial legacies that we still have that exist today. And for me, that seems crucial. And it points down to a few interventions, because there's also this fatigue that we're faced with in terms of policy making, where people have now accepted that government is actually very terrible at creating jobs or supporting jobs, and they've calculated that an average cost of a job created by government is around 50,000, I think, per annum, and it would be cheaper for government to just provide direct income transfers to individuals who are unemployed rather than supporting formal sector to create jobs. And I think it's precisely because of this, because our target and policy making is not where there's highest potential. As you say, the business sentiment is low, profitability is low, so big businesses aren't going to make any major investment decisions. But there's still activity happening at the informal sector. There's still a lot of creativity that exists even amongst unemployed or so-called non-economically active individuals, which could be easily unlocked by something like a universal access to broadband, for example. Can you imagine the amount of creativity that would unlock? Or even more targeted programs that are focused on the informal sector.
Yeah, yes, yeah. The only problem with that, Sia, is that the South African consumer, there's too much debt in South Africa, so consumption is driven by access to debt, and so if you think that small businesses will be able to carry this load, it's a bit of a stretch in that the South African consumer is already highly indebted, and so I agree. You need to unlock that creativity at the lowest end, at an individual or small scale, but you also need two or three big players to carry these small, to sort of like create that market, sort of like employ a big business like an Eskom or a Sasol can. All these small businesses get to feed off it.
This is where I actually want to push back and disagree. So for me, the first problem is a structural issue in South Africa, right? Let's take it that in the worst case scenario, apartheid, what it did, it created capital amongst 10% of the population, white South Africa, basically. My viewpoint is that this 10%, with all the money that they have, even if they were investing 100% of it, they just aren't big enough an economic base to create jobs for the entire economy. And I think that what we need to do is change the structure of the economy so that more of the mass 90% black South Africans who are unemployed and economically inactive, etc., are not necessarily major employers, but can even self-employ. For me, that is really the way in which we're going to upend this problem of unemployment. Whilst we're still relying on 10% of the population to invest, and in a context where there's 90% and sort of half of the workforce unemployed, they're not going to make those investments in terms of large businesses. Even if they do, as you say, rightfully say, consumption is led by credit. So how do we change that? Is that we focus on creating incomes at the lowest level so that the reliance on credit and reduce the reliance on social welfare as well, such that people can generate incomes that they're living on, and in a mass way, even if it is through self-employment and not creating big businesses that are going to employ 10,000 people. So I'm all for micro enterprise rather than, this whole notion of SMMEs, because when we talk SMMEs, people are talking businesses that at least employ 50 or 100 and upwards. And I think that even that is not enough, and we need to go even lower.
Yeah, I have a friend who also thinks that way. He runs an agro processing little business. I don't want to say little business because they turn over something like 850 million rands per annum. And he says we should go the Vietnam route, because the Vietnamese, they sort of like liberalized, in inverted commas, land production, agriculture, and so about a third of that economy, people are eking out a living from having these smallholder agricultural enterprises, and they are selling things like veggies and meat production and all of that. So yeah, you are right. I do agree in a way, because the structure is of our South African economy is highly concentrated, and it's exclusionary.
That takes us to our next story. Government's response to gender-based violence. The government has strongly condemned gender-based violence and femicide following the brutal killing of 3 women in the Eastern Cape, Northwest and Western Cape. This includes 23-year-old student Nostelum Tebeni, who was discovered in a suitcase in East London after being gruesomely murdered by her boyfriend, Alu Tapasile. Government has allocated at least 21 billion rand to fight against gender-based violence and femicide with the implementation of the National Strategic Plan, the NSP. Since launching of the NSP, 32 regional courts have been designated as sexual offense courts in various parts of the country, and about 3,500 investigating officers received specialized training on family violence, child protection, and sexual crimes. Zama, you had a very poignant point to raise about this one.
Thanks, Sias. I haven't really had sight of the National Strategic Plan, but I just have a view that the issue of gender-based violence goes beyond having, for example, a sexual offences officer allocated to courts. I think that this problem needs to be tackled at the root of the problem. Patriarchal systems have perpetuated the position of women in society. And, we have a big problem of patriarchy, or a problem, we could say, of patriarchy in South Africa, or that is the culture that we have, right? So both men and women need to be conscientized about the direction the world is moving. We have quite a conservative culture in South Africa, which leaves women vulnerable to all sorts of gender-based attacks. And I think in Africa, actually, as a whole, there is quite a patriarchal culture. So the programs we implement regarding gender-based violence need to be a little bit more aggressive and targeted. So allocating a court officer is allocating someone to deal with the problem once it's occurred, right? So we need to, the point is we need to eliminate the problem. So I've said this before, if we can have a vaccination drive at a national scale, I sometimes wonder, why can we not do the same for gender-based violence and really invest in ensuring the eradication of the social ill? Because it's one of the largest social ills that plagues particularly this country. So many statistics show that South Africa is one of the most unsafe countries for women to travel alone. And that breaks my heart as a South African. So I think more should be done on this issue at a local government level as well. An example or solution would be perhaps having training sessions, mandatory group therapy for men and women on gender-based violence, right? Like vaccines. So if we can take time in our day to get jabs, we should be able to create time in our day to face our social ills. But then obviously the government needs to provide the fertile ground for such activities.
Yeah, look, I agree with you to some extent, but I do want to push back a little bit to say that, from my point of view, and I don't claim to have a monopoly on understanding, gender-based violence, and it's also partly what you're saying, that it's a broader socioeconomic problem. And I think unlike the vaccines, which are seen as a silver bullet response to COVID-19, there's no similar response that would be a silver bullet to gender-based violence. And I think although most people point to the high unemployment rate and the low, household incomes that have been destroyed as a result, I think even that is not enough to resolve the whole problem. So I guess what I'm pointing at is it's not something that you'll take 2 jabs and be, cured of gender-based violence. It is a broader societal issue which touches on the socioeconomic issues, but also touches on issues of culture, which I think leads quite well to Sbu's point that he wants to make on, how this is actually seen as an endemic culture in South Africa, or Southern Africa actually, given that even our neighbors is, for example, Lesotho is amongst the highest concentration of gender-based violence convicts serving time at Maseru prison, for example. And so it is a socioeconomic but also a cultural issue. Sbu, on that point of culture, can you bring us some light as to what exactly you mean?
Yeah, you guys have said it almost all of it. Yeah, but anyhow, my input would be that the migrant labor system of both the colonial and the apartheid era had also something to do with it, because that system almost completely destroyed the socio-economic fiber of the natives, especially our family-based structure. So these acts of violence against women and children are mainly found among Black, African, and so-called colored communities, which bore the brunt of that system, which sought to dehumanize Black people. So South Africa now carries the unenviable tag as destination femicide. That's what they call it. It's our crime. This crime, femicide, is 5 times higher than the global average, and the female interpersonal violence death rate was the 4th highest among the 183 countries that the World Health Organization listed back in 2016. You are right. Legislation alone will not resolve this. Much more at a personal level needs to be done to confront the underlying causes and the triggers.
All right, and that brings us to our next story on the South Africa update, our final story, the NIPMO Free IP Summer School. The National Intellectual Property Management Office, NIPMO, will be hosting a summer school on intellectual property IP, aimed at increasing knowledge and understanding of IP rights. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions, the summer school will be held online from the 23rd until the 23rd of November until the 3rd of December, and the fees have been waived. And this is an initiative by the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, which will be hosted by NIPMO together with the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, CIPC. Registration is open until the 3rd of September, and applicants need to submit a CV and a letter of motivation via an online platform. And for those interested, the link is on our website, and you'll be able to then submit your applications. I think this is a great initiative, particularly given this high unemployment rate and the difficult economic context that we're in. Sbu, you're in agreement on this, and you've raised a point about the fees.
Yeah, for starters, I think that the fees have been, it's good that the fees have been waived. My view is that there is no need for charging for this kind of engagement in the first place. I hope now that they've started it, it goes beyond the pandemic period. Maybe only charge those who are present at the venue, and for the rest, everyone who gets to link through these virtual platforms, they should just do it for free. Anyway, is, my other input would be, there is very little investment in South Africa concerning research and development, especially by the private sector. So the concentration in the economy with which we were talking about means that there is little competition and too few products, meaning that corporates don't see the need to invest in developing new products because they are competing amongst like 5 or 6. So the only time they get jolted into research and development or any kind of IP rights would be when a multinational applies to invest in South Africa, and then they get their lawyers involved and they rush to the competition commission in a bid to prevent these new players coming in. So it's no wonder that in South Africa, the CSIR, which is a state-owned enterprise, is the biggest innovator. So there's no innovation at all. So my question is, who is the target? I mean, who will realize economic and other benefits from the commercialization of their creativity, besides the entertainment and the art industry, who always are keen to be present, to be represented at these events? Who else, in your view?
I think that's a good question, particularly because people mostly think of IP as the sort of top-end blue chip, innovation, R&D type of assets. And I think that might be a misconception because it is much broader. It also includes creative assets. And I think particularly given the fact that, so firstly, I think this is a great opportunity, particularly for, in the African context, where I strongly believe that cultural and creative industries, and this is, across the board, from musicians, artists, people with crafts, and the cultural industries broadly, are part of our heritage, but also part of our competitive advantage in the global economy. So I think that, apart from the artists, I think this is for anybody who is creative, really, and particularly in the context of high unemployment, so there's no job opportunities, people don't have income, so they don't have any capital to start any of their own businesses, but they do have creativity. This, to me, is a great opportunity for people to understand the value of those creative assets and the cultural assets which we already have. And I think that beyond just the legislation of intellectual property, government needs to create ecosystems where people can trade this creativity. For example, if we had an IP trading platform, we wouldn't be having issues such as the Vodacom Please Call Me litigation case currently, where an employee recommends a product to the employer, which ends up earning them billions of rands, but now is seeking for compensation through the courts. If, for example, we create an ecosystem where people with creativity, even if without assets or capital to start their own business, can monetize on those ideas, for me, will also be a major, major game changer. That will also plug this gap that you raise in terms of R&D, because yes, rightfully so, private sector is not investing much, particularly in research and development, and it's all part of the low business sentiment and low aggregate demand. But it doesn't mean that people who have no incomes don't have creativity which they could monetize. But it is more broader than just policing IP. We need to create those ecosystems where people can, trade their creativity with big business. Zama, you've been nodding and agreeing away.
Yeah, I think you make such good points. I think it's a really exciting opportunity, given the contentiousness of intellectual property issues in general at the moment. And I mean, even when we look at the perspective of pharmaceuticals and vaccines, so I think at the heart of this is intellectual property, So I just think it's a really, you make very, very interesting points on, particularly on what you're saying about being able to trade your creativity. I think there's so much value to that, and fostering the sort of culture where people come up with ideas, and particularly, like you're saying, sharing them with big business. We as like, how much of the economy has been built on people's IP, and people don't realize that, or even notice how much of their creative assets are being used and literally being converted into monetary sort of gain.
And they just have no avenue. I think it's twofold. People don't know the value of the creativity they have, but also there are no platforms for them to then trade that creativity with big business who would be able to monetize it. And, as the saying goes, we don't have a startup infrastructure like Silicon Valley or America has in terms of its venture capital. And so, capital and investment will never be applied to ideas except for in a context of a big business that is already existing, which has the money in order to experiment on some of these ideas. So for me, it's just a no-brainer. On that note, that brings an end to the SA update this week. Moving on to the Africa regional update for this week. Our first story in the Africa regional update is the EAC Regional Youth Peace and Security Platform. The East African Community EAC Joint Sectoral Council on Interstate Security and Foreign Policy Coordination has adopted a framework for establishing a regional youth peace and security platform. The ministers further noted that there was a deep need to develop a mechanism for mapping areas with potential insecurity that require youth intervention. And the meeting noted that partner states' ministries responsible for EAC affairs should take an active role in coordinating and implementing the regional platform on youth, peace and security as approved, and also approved a plan for 2021 to 2026. Zama, you have a view on this story.
I'm just loving the emphasis of youth participating in issues facing Africa. I think, as you may know, Africa has the youngest population, and I think we should really invest and, utilize our youth to drive Africa forward for peace. It actually reminds me of a story we covered a couple of weeks ago, where I think it was the Ethiopian government, which was calling on the youth to join the military. But the final point that I have to this is that I think this should transcend to go to emphasis on youth being involved in actual governance or parliament.
Sbu, what's your view on this one?
I also agree that Africa has a very young demographic, but that can be a stepping stone towards rapid economic growth and possibly a huge market for African products. The same can be a big hindrance, a stumbling block, if there's no job creation, if there is little income distribution, or the massive wealth inequality persists. So it's nice to hear about this meaningful engagement and participation. But those economic, the economic side of things has also to be closely monitored.
Which is linked to our next story about the AU youth participation in electoral processes. So this week, the AU Commission, through the Africa Governance Architecture, the AGA Secretariat, in a joint project with COMESA, held a training program for youth participation in political and electoral processes in Banjul, the Gambia. And the training is based on a comprehensive training of trainers manual, which was developed to support the creation of national, regional, and continental training programs focused on enhancing meaningful engagement in electoral processes by the youth. And running the program in the Gambia is particularly timely, given that they've just recently had a voters registration process in preparation for the presidential elections scheduled for December, which will be followed by the National Assembly elections in 2022. Zama, you had a point about this in relation to South Africa.
Yes, I found it interesting, this training, and which is focused on enhancing meaningful engagement in electoral processes by the youth. I think South Africa and other countries struggling with voter apathy could use the strategy. I think our youth needs to be more actively involved in our democracy and the direction of Africa in general. So I think this is quite a great initiative.
And I think especially if we look at some of the statistics we dealt with a couple of weeks back, Spoo, you might remember, where we found that of the 15 million unregistered voters, 60% of them, or at least 12 million, are younger than the age of 30. And for me, this is very concerning, particularly given that this is also the age group hardest hit by the economic reality, at least in South Africa, of high unemployment and difficult economic conditions. And that brings an end to that story, takes us to our next story on the bubonic plague in the DRC. So more than 578 cases of the bubonic plague and 44 plague-related deaths were recorded in Ituri province in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo between 2020 and 2021. Bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, is an infectious disease caused by Yersinia pestis. Okay, I'm not a scientist. It's caused by Yersinia pestis. Okay, it's a bacteria which is usually found in small mammals and their fleas, and is characterized by painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes. And the outbreaks are often blamed on poor sanitation and hygiene practices, which attract rats carrying fleas searching for food who infect people in their homes. So while the disease can be fatal, it's easily treatable with antibiotics. And the DRC, specifically Ituri, is, as well as Madagascar and Peru, are the only places worldwide where cases continue to be reported. Spoo, you had a point about this age-old Black Death.
Yeah, this is an old disease which led to Black Death back in Asia, Central Asia to be specific, and Europe, from as early as the 1300s. So my question is, why do we still have such a disease in the 21st century? Does it point to underdevelopment? That most of Africa is still very rural. Many still live in sort of like pre-industrial age conditions. So I suppose my question is a question that was posed to me this week here by someone who wrote to Ubuntunomics about urbanization and rural development. I think there's a link there. What are your thoughts?
I'm inclined to agree, but also remembering that, Ituri is one of the provinces in Eastern DRC that has also been faced with repeated insurgents and fights due to the secessionists, as well as the insurgence of rebel groups from neighboring countries. So yes, I think there's definitely a lack of infrastructure development and development generally, given that also, government has had difficulty in even reaching certain parts of those eastern provinces, and hence the ongoing violence that still continues. And, being a disease that's purely hygiene related, to me, also speaks to a problem of access to water. So I definitely agree with you that it's all related to lack of development and lack of government capacity to develop these further, far flung and outlying areas. And that brings us to our last story on the Africa Update for this week, on peace being the essential ingredient for Sudan and South Sudan refugees. Finding a peaceful solution is crucial for the future of nearly 7 million forcibly displaced people from Sudan and South Sudan. After the governments of Sudan and South Sudan signed the revitalized peace agreement in 2018, close to 300,000 South Sudanese refugees spontaneously returned, with over 1 million more displaced inside the country, also going back to their homes. However, in June 2021, the head of the United Nations missions in South Sudan, UNIMIS, warned that the pervasive insecurity, in particular intercommunal violence, continues to undermine sustainable peace, and nearly 3 years later, many of the requirements of the revitalized agreements have not been met. Smoo, you had a point on this one.
Yeah, my point is, for as long as there is still armed conflict and violence, there will be no security. I mean, this initiative must be applauded, but in the same breath, I think nothing would attract returnees more than economic opportunities. The process of building a new country, a nation, can and should result in a lot of economic activity, which should attract skills and resources which were exported by the long civil war.
On that note, that brings an end to our Africa update this week. And that brings us to the numbers game. So the number for this week is $7.3 million. Who wants to go first in terms of a guess what it means?
$7.3 million. That's a lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
Any hint, South Africa or Africa? No hint, South Africa. Is it South Africa? I think let me go for South Africa. 70 investment. A small company wants to invest in South Africa in maybe the IT sector. Yeah, okay.
What's your guess, Sama?
I think $7.3 million must be what some CEO of some NASDAQ or JSE listed company must be earning per annum. Honestly, a lot of money.
Well, I think the amount depends on the context. So the number is $7.3 million in funding for youth jobs. So the African Development Bank, the AFDB's Technical Review Committee, recently approved 8 projects to receive funding in an important milestone for its Jobs for Youth in Africa strategy. The projects will receive grant funding of more than $7.3 million to operationalize their activities, create several new enterprises, and an estimated 20,000 jobs for youth across the continent. Through the Youth Entrepreneurship and Innovation Multi-Donor Trust Fund, which opened a call in 2020, the AFDB received nearly 24 proposals for the committee to review and approved projects including a business development support for agricultural entrepreneurs selling online in Malawi and Zimbabwe, training to staff members of Libya's Ministry of Labor to better meet the needs of young entrepreneurs, including women and people living with disabilities, and also funding an online training and accelerator program for entrepreneurs in textile, apparel, and accessories industries. So there you have it.
100.
Don't feel like it's a lot of money?
I quickly did a calculation. It's 100 million rand for the entire continent, which has about 500 million young people. This is like...
So it's a drop, it's a grain of sugar to sweeten the ocean. I definitely don't think it's going to have a major impact. 20,000 jobs created. It's commendable, but they need to do a lot more to have a significant impact.
lot more. Like 10 times more, yeah.
But on the other side, though, I'm actually more concerned by the fact that they only received 24 proposals. I think either this wasn't very well marketed, but I'm constantly seeing ideas and business that could have been funded on my social media every day. People posting ideas of, generators that run on water or generators that run on urine, etc. Solar lamps that don't need, that can help kids learn at night. And I'm very surprised that out of the whole continent, they only received 24 proposals and only approved 8. So
because they only sent it to their friends.
Yes.
Yeah, because they only sent it to their friends, yeah.
But honestly, I think this is a problem. Honestly, Sia, what you're saying for me speaks to some of the issues that we've already spoken about in the episode earlier. To say, for example, I think that, for example, the informal economy, the township economy struggles from that very perspective. There's a lot of great ideas. There's a lot of people with amazing ideas, but the red tape, the administration. People do not have sufficient training around those aspects as to how to actually obtain the funding, how to actually make sure that they set themselves up where they're in a position that the government cannot say no, or cannot disapprove the application. So I think that's actually where the problem lies, that yes, there's funding, but there's only few people who actually have the resources, the capacity to do what needs to be done in order to secure the funds. So that's my issue.
Yeah, I agree with you.
100%. On that note, that brings an end to our episode this week.
Africa.